In this video, we will explore the tools you can use in Martini to consume an API. To use any of these tools, however, you'll need a Martini package for storing the generated services. I'll create and name my package consuming. Let's start by consuming a Swagger schema. Before proceeding, I'll create a directory underneath my package's code directory, which I'll name Swagger. This is where I want Martini to put the services generated from the Swagger schema. To launch the Gloop API wizard, right-click the directory where you want to save the services. In my case, this is Swagger, and then select Gloop API. Select Consume as a type. Click Next. Provide your schema. I'll be using the published pet store schema from Swagger's website. To do that, I'll copy the schema's URL and then paste it in this text box. Ensure Swagger is selected as a source. Lastly, click Finish. The wizard will prompt Martini to generate Gloop services that consume the operations defined in the provided schema. Let's take a look at the generated appet Gloop service. From the operation ID, we know this service is for consuming the schema-defined appet operation. Generated services will have predefined inputs. Among these is operation URL, whose value will be equivalent to the URL of the operation defined in the schema. Next is body. This property only exists when an operation requires a body. It references a Gloop model, which Martini automatically generates from the provided schema definition. Generated models can be found under the model directory. And lastly, we have the content type property, which refers to the request body's desired content type. By default, its value is set to application/JSON. Generated services will have predefined outputs as well. A generated service's output properties include the resulting HTTP response code and other properties that are included in the response. Let's now take a look at the steps that make up the appet service. The first step declares the headers which will be used later in the request. Next is a call to the HTTP one-liner method, which sends the actual HTTP request. As you can see, inputs are automatically mapped to the parameters of the one-liner. This one-liner will return the operation's HTTP response, which is then mapped to the output properties of the service. Next is a fork step, which checks the response code. When the response code is 405, the description output properties value is set to invalid input. Checks such as these are derived from the list of possible responses defined in the schema. Let's run the service. Upon checking the output, we can see that a response code of 200 was returned. The description property is empty because there was no value for it in the schema. Operations can contain parameters on their URL as well, such as this getPetById operation. When generating services for consumption, Martini will automatically add these parameters as service inputs. It will also add required credentials as input properties, like API key here, at least for secured operations. You can use the same steps we've discussed just now to generate Gloop services from an open API schema. Next, let's consume a WSDL schema. I'll be creating another directory, but this time I'll call it WSDL. And from this directory, I'll launch the Gloop API wizard. Like what we did earlier, you can provide the source schema via URL, but you can also specify the schema by browsing it on your file system or by dragging and dropping the file to the wizard. Next, and this is very important, is to select WSDL for the source field. Click Finish. For WSDL schemas, Martini will generate SOAP 1.1 and 1.2 services. Like before, request and response models will be generated. Auth input properties will be added for passing credentials required by the operation. And fault models will be defined among service output properties. Generated service steps will be fairly similar, save for the call to SOAP instead of HTTP, which will send the SOAP request. Next, we'll consume a Postman collection. Again, I'll create a directory, Postman, and call the Gloop API wizard from there. To consume a Postman collection, you must select Postman collection as a source, and then specify the collection you want to consume. As of this video, Martini can only consume version 2.1 collections, so if your collection is written in an older version, you would need to re-export it as a version 2.1 collection. I'll be using my weather collection, and then I'll click Finish to signal the generation of services. Now let's take a look at Get Current Weather, the only service Martini generated from my Postman collection. The consumed operation is secured with basic authentication, hence the presence of the basic username and basic password input properties. These will be used in order to specify the credentials required by the operation. The consumed operation also defines a path variable. Path variables, as usual, will be redefined as service inputs. For Postman collections in particular, they will be declared under the parameters input model. There will also be input properties for body parameters, if any, and they will be declared under the request params input model. The service will automatically define the response of the operation as the output. Like Swagger-derived services, you'll notice headers are also declared in the first step, followed by a call to the HTTP one-liner. Next, we'll consume a WADL schema. Like before, I'll create another directory, WADL, and then invoke the wizard there. Select WADL as the source and then specify the WADL schema you want to consume. For this video, I'll have Martini consume a WADL equivalent of the Swagger PetStar schema I consumed earlier. Then click Finish. You'll notice these WADL-generated services are nearly identical to those I generated from Swagger. Like those, these services will declare an input property for the request body, and they too will return a response code and content. And of course, they will also use the HTTP methods.http one-liner to send the request. Lastly, we'll consume a RAML schema. RAML is a YAML-based schema that describes a REST API. As usual, I'll create another directory, and then call the Gloop API wizard. Select RAML as a source, and then provide the RAML schema you want to consume. I've got a RAML schema equivalent of the PetStar Swagger schema earlier, which I'll consume. The results again will be similar, but for RAML schema-derived services, you will have additional input properties named URL and base URI. The URL property's value will be the base URI prefixed operation URL. And those are all the different types of schemas you can consume using the Gloop API wizard. Another wizard you can use to consume APIs is the Gloop HTTP Client Service wizard. Instead of schemas, this wizard generates a Gloop service from an HTTP request. You can launch this wizard by right-clicking on the directory where you want the to-be-generated service to reside, selecting New and then Gloop HTTP Client Service. In the wizard, you need to provide a name for the service and configure the requests you wish to send. At a minimum, you'll have to provide the HTTP method and URL. Path variables can be added by editing the URL and then wrapping the path in curly braces and then prefixing it with $. Or for an easier time, just double-click the path. If you want to generate a Gloop model for the response, check the Generate Gloop Model from Response checkbox and provide a test value for the wizard. If you have request parameters in the URL, they will automatically be detected by the wizard, and it will be ported as service input properties. You can also specify the body and headers that will be sent with your request. If your web service is secured, you can choose from the different types of authorization and provide default credentials. You can also configure how the response will be returned by the service and the content type of the response. After you're finished configuring a request, click Finish. Soon after, the service will be generated, along with the corresponding response model if you've opted to generate one. If you have existing requests saved in the Martini desktop HTTP client, you can easily generate a Gloop service that consumes the requested web service. This is done by right-clicking the Save Request and then selecting Export as Gloop Service. This will bring up the Gloop HTTP client wizard, where you can further customize your request. If the API you want to consume doesn't have a published, standards-compliant schema, you can check out the Docs to Open API Chrome plugin. This plugin can help you generate an Open API schema from the API's documentation. And that concludes our video on the tools you can use in Martini to consume an API.